In sports, it's going to come to a point where people aren't necessarily going to get along, because at some point people are going to start arguing, whether that's over prize money, a proposed rule set, a calendar, or how many events are on a particular tour. But really, it's money. Money is the root of all evil, as they say, and especially the case in sport. Just recently, there has been the Live Golf Tour that was the enemy of the PGA in the same way that Galileo was to the Catholic Church, only for them to later shake hands and be all buddy-buddy. The European Super League in football, which has reared its ugly head again recently, and they really want to go ahead with it. It's going to be a lot of fun watching Real Madrid play Barcelona every week, because they're the only two teams that are going to be involved at this rate. And while not necessarily money related, more a case of national pride, was the American open wheel racing civil war, where Tony George, the boss of the Indianapolis Motor Speedway, had decided that the all-American race in Indiana every May had become too full of foreigners and or so-called F1 rejects, and decided that he was going to set up his own racing league where everybody was American and they were only going to be racing on ovals. He also shut out the kart regulars with the 25-8 rule, and his new all-American race had a Colombian, a Mexican, an Italian, a Frenchman, a Dutch previous winner of the race, a Brazilian, a Spaniard, and a Chilean and Italian F1 reject. Thankfully, all of that is now behind them. Kart and IndyCar has since unified, and now this year's Indy 500 had, well, mostly foreigners and F1 rejects. Meanwhile, at the so-called pinnacle of motorsport, Formula 1 isn't immune to such threats and attempts. Back in 1981, at the height of what they called the FISA-FOCA war, a video on this has been done before and I'll leave a card if I remember, well, basically in this period, Bernie Ecclestone, the head of FOCA, was at odds with Jean-Marie Balestre, the head of FISA, what we now call the FIA. It was all a spat born out of a perceived bias from FOCA towards the manufacturer teams. FOCA was the union of the privateer entries like McLaren, Arrows, Williams, Brabham and Ligier, while the manufacturers in Ferrari, Renault and Alfa Romeo were more aligned with FISA, and FOCA thought that everything was being done in favour of FISA's little clique of manufacturer teams. Long story short, although the full story is there if you want it, the Breakaway series wasn't really successful. One series didn't have a big draw name like Ferrari, and the other series was basically the Ferrari Cup, so people weren't interested there either. So they kissed and made up, and the Concord Agreement was signed to let the teams know where they sat, in terms of money and commitments to the sport. Fast forward another 30 years or so, and Formula 1 is in another pickle, although this one starts off slightly different because the real kickstarter to all of this is the financial crash in 2008 that resulted in the likes of Bridgestone, Honda and Toyota all leaving the sport. There had also been past scuffles regarding the Concord Agreement too. In 1997, the document was set to be ratified with the new terms and conditions, but Williams, McLaren and Tyrrell wouldn't sign because they believed Ecclestone wasn't allowing them to make the maximum return out of the commercial opportunities, which now was about to jump right up thanks to the increased broadcast revenue and the amount of sponsorship that was now on offer. As such, the teams re-entered the meeting room, and the new document would not be signed until 1998. Then, in 2001, a group called GPWC Holdings was formed by the car manufacturers that were in Formula 1 at that particular point in time. BMW, who were with Williams, Daimler Chrysler, who were with McLaren, Fiat, which owns Ferrari, Ford that had the Jaguar team on the grid, and Renault, which was about to re-enter as a factory team once it had purchased back the Benetton team. The team principals were then invited to a meeting, with the exception of Tom Walkinshaw, in the November of 2001. This is where the original seeds of the Breakaway were sown. Even though the actual thing didn't really kick off until about 2009, the seeds were sown in 2000 or 2001. Basically what happened was Kirch Media owned the commercial rights to Formula 1, and they sort of held on to all of the money associated with Formula 1 because it's very, very complicated, but really the threat was from the manufacturers: pay us more prize money or we're gone when this Concord Agreement runs out at the end of 2007. For some extra context here, Kirch had got hold of all of this because the company that was originally holding onto it, EM.TV, was in financial trouble. And EM.TV had purchased Speed Investments for around £1 billion. That's £1 billion back in 2001, buying that from Hellman and Friedman, who had bought from Morgan Grenfell. Okay, let me break this down a little bit better for you. In 1999, Morgan Grenfell bought 12.5% of SLEC, a holding company set up by Bernie in 1996, which was then going to be transferred to his wife in 1997 so it could be floated on the stock market. Another company called ISC, International Sports World Communicators, had signed a 14-year deal with the FIA for the broadcasting rights. Then in the February of 2000, Hellman and Friedman bought 37.5% of SLEC and combined those shares with Morgan Grenfell's to create the company Speed Investments. so in doing so they owned 50% of SLEC. Then EM.TV bought Speed Investments for that £1.1 billion fee that I mentioned about 2 paragraphs ago. Investment company's going to invest, I guess, or buy and flip for profit. EM.TV's acquisition was a company killer. This is where Kirch came in to rescue things, and they bought out that 50% that was the combined Morgan Grenfell and Hellman and Friedman share, taking loans from Bayern LB, a German bank, JP Morgan, and the Lehman Brothers of all people to increase EM.TV's share from 50% to 75%, which then meant they controlled the board at Formula One Holdings. Hence the manufacturers setting up this particular group, because they were all under contract until 2007 with the Concord Agreement, and then when that ran out they basically had free rein to leave, so they were demanding more money so they could get it all sorted in time so they didn't have to go anywhere. In the November of 2004, the banks involved wanted to sue Eccleston for more control, and it looked like Bernie would lose his grip on the sport and his time as F1 Supremo would come to an end. The courts ruled in favour of the banks and Bernie decided to appeal the decision. Now, I'm no lawyer or judge, but I think when something is under appeal, it doesn't fully go through yet. Of all the places to learn that, it was when Trump had his gag orders put in place, so while under appeal he can still say what he wants to say. So while under appeal, Bernie called all the team principals to a meeting at Heathrow Airport and offered them $260 million over 3 years. In return, they would all sign the new Concord Agreement for 2008. It later turned out the banks had no intention of removing Eccleston. In the November of 2005, CVC Capital acquired the majority shares of the Formula One rights, and it was approved by the European Commission in the March of 2006. CVC initially bought the Bayern LB and Bambino, Bernie's shares of SLEC, and then acquired JP Morgan's in December. Following that was the purchase of the Lehman Brothers shares in the March of 2006. Bernie used the money from his sale of the shares to then invest back in. But in 2005, Ferrari and Fiat had announced that they'd signed a deal with Bernie in secret and already put their signatures down on that 2008 Concord Agreement in exchange for $100 million, and hoped that everybody else would follow. That $240 million that Bernie had offered over the 3 years, so it equated to about $40 million a year, had since been retracted, so anyone who signed the Concord Agreement after Ferrari wouldn't get paid. But in doing so, Toyota and Honda had inquired about joining GPWC. GPWC had initially attempted to lure Ferrari in with the promises of $50 million up front and then 4% of any commercial revenue thereafter. Montezemolo had also been Fiat's representative at GPWC when the whole thing got reshuffled in sort of early 2002 because, bits and pieces are going on. By 2005, what had also happened is that not only had they lost Ferrari, they'd also lost Ford because Red Bull had bought out the Jaguar team. It's all very, very, very confusing. In 2008, a spiritual successor to FOCA was set up at Maranello in the July of that year. FOTA, the Formula One Teams Association, was formed to be the union of the teams in the sport, and like FOCA before it, would use its one massive combined voice to make sure that the teams all got what they were looking for, and was, on the date of its formation, led by Luca de Montezemolo. And this was all set up because of a rule change that was looking to be introduced. Cost caps. That's what it was. While we do actually have the cost caps in Formula 1 today, back then they were proposed to be there initially as a response to the 2008 market crash and allow all the teams to spend within their means. It was also these proposed caps that were part of the deal for the 3 new teams that were going to enter for the 2010 season. All 3 of those teams I've looked at before in a previous video. It's interesting how all of these link together, isn't it? Max Mosely's initial plan was to allow the teams to either spend what they wanted, or they could optionally sign up to a $30 million cost cap. Now you might be thinking, hang on a minute, optional cost cap. Well, one of the teams is going to say, yeah, we'll sign up to it, and then their rival team's going to go, nah, we're going to spend what we want, right? That would be the logical way of thinking, and I don't blame you for thinking that way. However, Mosely basically said that if you took on this optional budget cap of $30 million, you'll get bigger design freedoms for your car. So you can run things on your cheap car that the one spending unlimited money on can't. So in effect, right, let's give you an example. Let's say that McLaren said that they'll take the optional cost cap, but Red Bull won't. McLaren could, in effect, run a blown and double diffuser, if they'd thought of that, obviously, while Red Bull might not be able to. Depends on the rulebook. Yes, it's very confusing. So it basically created 2 different rule sets for the championship. You might as well have multi-class racing at this point, and Ferrari recognised that immediately. They went to a court in Paris and said that the FIA can't do this. The court later threw the protest out, because Ferrari had been given so much power within the sport thanks to their ties with the governing body, and the fact they've been given the veto to, well, veto any technical changes that they don't agree with. I didn't actually know this when I started writing all of it, but it turns out that the courts found out that Ferrari had not once used this veto at any meeting of the World Motorsport Council since they'd actually been given this veto. So the courts basically said, you've got no legal challenge here. Yeah, I don't understand it either. In turn, during the 2009 season, Ferrari, Sauber, Toyota, Renault, Braun, Red Bull and Toro Rosso protested by not submitting entries for the 2010 season, a decision for which was made by all the teams at the Monaco Grand Prix. Williams and Force India were then suspended from FOTA because while they'd initially been part of the agreement, Frank and Vijay had signed up for 2010 about 3 days later. The 29th of May deadline passed for sign-ups and Williams and Force India were in for 2010. Williams did so because they existed purely to race. While the deadlines had passed, all the teams were still able to apply if they wanted to because the FIA had agreed to extend the deadline for them so as to give them enough time to get everything sorted out. Teams were willing to sign a new agreement and commit to about 2012 so long as this cost cap rule be abolished. And at a meeting in Enstone at Renault's base, they started drawing up the plans for a breakaway series. A series that would have shades of the USAC kart split in 1979, where loads of teams broke off from USAC to race in kart. The FIA initially called in the lawyers but then changed their mind, willing to sit down and talk with the teams over what to do. And support for this breakaway series was pretty damn high. Sky Sports Italia did a poll and it was a 91% approval rate. Network 10 in Australia had a 65% approval rate. In the June of 2009, just before the British Grand Prix, FOTA leaked a provisional calendar for their breakaway series. A mix of tracks that were on the calendar, some that had previously been on the calendar, and some that were brand new. The season would start in Argentina in March and end in November at either Adelaide or the Surfers Paradise Street Circuit on the Gold Coast. The most interesting of these races, for me at least, is the race in Finland in Helsinki and a race at the Speedway in Lausitz in Germany, the place where Alex Zanardi had his near-fatal accident. But let me know which ones you would have liked to see in the comments. What was also interesting about this list is that there are a couple of fan favourite races on there that have been removed at some point. Mexico, Montreal, which wasn't on the calendar in 2009, Imola and Indianapolis. Clever move. Get the fans on side with the calendar. On the 24th of June, 3 days after the British Grand Prix, a meeting was held in Paris where Max Mosely agreed to not stand for re-election if the teams abandoned their breakaway, and it looked like the saga would be over. But it was all thrown back up in the air when it was alleged that De Montezemolo had called Mosely a dictator and that Luca would not be a part of Formula 1 unless Max went. The FOTA teams later said at the German Grand Prix in July that they were interested in ending the spat, so long as they negotiated the new Concord agreement with Bernie and CVC. It was hoped that the situation would be over by the Hungarian Grand Prix. Bernie said he'd have the whole thing sorted within 48 hours, and on the 15th of July 2009, Max Mosely said that he'd be stepping down at the end of his current term. At the Hungarian Grand Prix, the teams were all willing to sign the new document, but the FIA was still adamant about these cost-cutting measures. Williams and Manor, the latter of which would be on the grid for 2010, objected to a few of these changes. The FIA wanted to homologate the front and rear wings among other things, while BMW announced that they were leaving Formula 1 citing current developments. The teams just needed the FIA to sign their half of the document, and on the 1st of August 2009, the FIA finally agreed to the team's demands regarding the rules. The dispute was over. This whole debacle regarding cost caps and other things ended up having the desired effect for the teams already in the sport, but crippled the ones who were on the way in. HRT, Virgin and Caterham had all been lured into the sport on the basis that cost caps were going to exist, only for them to not be there by the time they arrived. All three teams were going to be operating on meagre budgets anyway, but even the likes of Sauber, who were also going to be near the back of the grid, Toro Rosso and Williams as well, they were only ever going to be outspent by Toro Rosso, Williams and Sauber. The gulf in spending between the existing teams and the new ones was massive, and none of those three teams survived the decade. Now the sport does have cost caps that are vastly larger than what was anticipated in 2010, but then the cost of an F1 car has vastly increased in that time, as well as inflation driving the costs up even further in the last couple of years. On top of this, Formula 1 now commands a $200 million entrance fee to cover the lost revenue for the other 10 teams on the grid, because the prize pool dilutes with the 11th or 12th team being on the grid. This is something else that might need sorting because the FIA and the commercial rights holders are at odds with that currently, like now. You've got one side saying more races and 10 teams, which no, and the other is saying fewer races and more teams. Yes. The Concord Agreement is next up at the end of 2025, just in time for the new engine regulations to come into effect, but it's also a very complex and opaque document. We only ever see a small overview of it all. This current one protects the existing teams, for instance. Maybe a new one will do something else. But it's one of those things, really. Was it all a power play to get the FIA to be like, no, don't leave, we can still be friends, I still love you, and all of that stuff? Or was it a genuine attempt at breaking away? Let me know down in the comments. So then, a look at the other time F1 tried a breakaway after the carnage of the early 80s. If this has been interesting for you and I've taught you something new, then do like the video so I know I've done a good job. And for more like this, get subscribed with the bell on so you never miss out on anything else I do around here. Massive thanks to the fine bunch of lads at Patreon for the continued support, and if you want to contribute to the picture purchasing piggy bank, then a link to Patreon is in the description, along with links to Discord, socials, and my affiliate links. Also under the video is super thanks if you want to buy me a New Year's tipple, or there's also memberships if that's more your thing. So until next time, I've been AdmiralLaWind, have a great day wherever you are, and goodbye.